They treated her like trash, then she bought their company. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and Sarah Martinez stepped into the marble lobby of Blackstone Industries, her heels clicking against the polished floor like a countdown to something inevitable, something that had been building for 15 years, something that would change everything before the sun set on this cold October day in Manhattan. She wore a charcoal gray suit that cost more than most people made in a month, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that revealed the small scar behind her left ear, a reminder of the night she had crawled through broken glass to escape the fire that had consumed her childhood home, the same fire that had taught her that survival meant becoming someone else entirely. The receptionist, a blonde woman with perfectly manicured nails and a smile that never reached her eyes, looked up from her computer screen with the kind of practiced indifference that Sarah remembered all too well from her days as a janitor in this very building, when she had been invisible, when she had been nothing, when she had cleaned the toilets of people who wouldn't even acknowledge her existence. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her voice carrying that particular tone that suggested helping was the last thing she wanted to do. "I'm here to see Marcus Blackstone," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions threatening to tear her apart from the inside, despite the memories that crashed over her like waves against rocks, despite the fact that she was about to face the man who had destroyed her life and didn't even remember her name. The receptionist's eyebrows rose slightly, a small crack in her professional facade, because Marcus Blackstone didn't take unscheduled meetings. Because Marcus Blackstone was the kind of man who made others wait in his outer office for hours just to prove he could, because Marcus Blackstone was currently in the middle of what he didn't know would be the last board meeting of his career. "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked, her fingers already moving toward the security button that would summon guards to escort this woman out, this woman who looked familiar in a way that made something uncomfortable twist in her stomach. Sarah reached into her briefcase, her movements deliberate and precise, and withdrew a manila envelope that contained documents that would make grown men weep, documents that represented years of careful planning, years of building an empire in the shadows, years of waiting for this exact moment when she would reveal herself to be the spider at the center of a web that Marcus Blackstone had unknowingly walked into. "Tell him that Sarah Martinez is here," she said, placing the envelope on the reception desk with the kind of gentle care one might use when handling a bomb, "and tell him that I own 49% of his company as of 9 a.m. this morning." The receptionist's face went white, her hand freezing halfway to the security button, because even she knew that name, even she had heard the whispers about the mysterious investor who had been quietly buying up shares of Blackstone Industries for months. The ghost who had been moving pieces on a chessboard that Marcus Blackstone didn't even know he was playing on. 23 floors above them, in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of Central Park, Marcus Blackstone sat at the head of a mahogany table surrounded by 12 men in expensive suits, men who had made their fortunes by stepping on others, men who had built their empires on the backs of people they considered beneath them. Men who were about to discover that their world was much smaller and more fragile than they had ever imagined. Marcus was 62 years old, with silver hair that had been carefully arranged to hide his receding hairline, with a face that had been softened by years of expensive meals and hardened by years of ruthless business decisions, with hands that had never known manual labor but had signed papers that had destroyed thousands of lives without a second thought. He was in the middle of explaining why the company needed to lay off another 1,000 workers to maintain their profit margins, his voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that comes from never having to worry about where your next meal will come from, when his secretary burst through the conference room doors with a look of panic that made everyone in the room turn to stare. "Mr. Blackstone," she said, her voice shaking, "there's a woman downstairs who says she owns 49% of the company." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that comes before earthquakes, before avalanches, before the moment when everything you thought you knew about the world reveals itself to be a lie built on quicksand. Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass, because the idea was absurd, because he personally oversaw every major stock transaction, because he had built this company from nothing and no one could take it away from him, no one could threaten what he had spent his entire life creating. "That's impossible," he said, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly challenged, never having faced someone who had spent years planning his downfall, never having looked into the eyes of someone who had nothing left to lose. But even as he spoke, something cold began to settle in his stomach, because he remembered the mysterious transactions that had been happening over the past year, the shell companies and offshore accounts that had been buying up small blocks of shares, the pattern that his lawyers had assured him was nothing to worry about, the web that he was now beginning to realize had been carefully constructed around him. His phone buzzed, and he looked down to see a text message from his head of security, a message that made his blood run cold, a message that contained just 3 words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "She's here, sir." 15 years earlier, on a night when the snow fell like tears over the south side of Chicago, a 17-year-old girl named Sarah Martinez had stood in the ruins of her family's apartment building, watching everything she had ever known disappear into smoke and ash, watching her dreams of college and a better life crumble like the walls that had collapsed around her. The fire had been ruled an accident, but Sarah knew better, because she had seen the men in expensive suits who had visited her landlord, because she had heard the whispered conversations about insurance money and development deals, because she had watched her neighborhood slowly transform as poor families were pushed out to make room for luxury condos and artisanal coffee shops. Her parents had died in that fire, along with her 2 younger brothers, and Sarah had survived only because she had been working her night shift at the diner, earning money to help pay for groceries, trying to keep her family fed while her father struggled to find work after the factory closed, after Blackstone Industries had moved their manufacturing overseas to save money on labor costs. She had crawled through the wreckage looking for survivors, cutting her hands on broken glass, breathing smoke that would leave her with a cough that lasted for months, finding nothing but death and destruction and the smell of dreams burning. The official investigation had lasted 3 weeks, but Sarah had known from the beginning that justice would never come, that the man who had caused this would never face consequences, that the system was designed to protect people like Marcus Blackstone and destroy people like her. She had been placed in foster care, bounced between homes where she was either ignored or abused, where she learned that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, those who had power and those who were crushed by it, those who made the rules and those who suffered under them. At 18, she had aged out of the system with nothing but the clothes on her back, a high school diploma, and a burning desire for revenge that would sustain her through the darkest years of her life, through nights when she slept on park benches, through days when she didn't eat because she was saving every penny for her education. She had worked 3 jobs while attending community college, cleaning offices at night, waiting tables during the day, and tutoring rich kids whose parents paid her more in an hour than she made in a week at her other jobs, rich kids who treated her like she was invisible, like she was a machine designed to help them pass their classes and nothing more. But Sarah had been watching, always watching, learning how the wealthy lived, how they talked, how they moved through the world with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about anything, how they made connections that would serve them for the rest of their lives, how they built networks of power that kept them safe and kept others down. She had transferred to Northwestern University on a full scholarship, majoring in business and economics, spending her free time in the library reading about corporate law and investment strategies, about hostile takeovers and leveraged buyouts, about all the ways that money could be turned into more money, about all the ways that power could be accumulated and wielded. Her professors had been impressed by her dedication, by her hunger for knowledge, by the way she absorbed information like a sponge, but they had also been disturbed by something in her eyes, something cold and calculating that suggested she was learning these things not for noble purposes but for something darker, something that would have frightened them if they had known the truth. She had graduated summa cum laude, earning a job at a prestigious investment firm in New York, where she had worked 80-hour weeks and slept in her office, where she had made her bosses millions of dollars while earning a fraction of what they made, where she had watched rich men get richer while the poor got poorer, where she had learned that the system was even more corrupt than she had imagined. But she had also been learning, always learning, about how money moved through the world, about how companies could be bought and sold like commodities, about how the right person in the right place with the right information could topple empires, about how patience and planning could accomplish what violence never could. She had saved every penny she earned, living in a studio apartment in Queens, eating ramen noodles and generic cereal, wearing the same 3 suits to work every day, investing her money in carefully chosen stocks and bonds, building her wealth slowly and methodically, creating the foundation for what would eventually become her revenge. After 5 years at the investment firm, she had quit and started her own hedge fund, using her reputation and connections to attract investors who didn't ask too many questions about her methods, who only cared about the returns she generated, who were happy to let her manage their money as long as she kept making them richer. She had been careful to keep a low profile, operating through shell companies and offshore accounts, using lawyers and accountants who specialized in discretion, building a network of assets that couldn't be traced back to her, creating an empire that existed in the shadows, invisible to those who might try to stop her. And all the while, she had been watching Blackstone Industries, studying their financial reports, tracking their stock price, learning about their business practices, their corporate structure, their vulnerabilities, waiting for the right moment to strike, waiting for the perfect opportunity to destroy the man who had destroyed her family. The elevator climbed toward the 23rd floor with a smoothness that spoke of German engineering and unlimited maintenance budgets, carrying Sarah toward a confrontation that had been 15 years in the making, toward a moment when the past would finally catch up with the present, toward a reckoning that would change everything for everyone involved. She could feel her heart beating in her chest like a drum, could taste the metallic flavor of adrenaline on her tongue, could smell the expensive cologne that Marcus Blackstone wore, the same cologne that had lingered in the air the night he had visited her landlord, the same cologne that had been her first clue that he was involved in the fire that had killed her family. The elevator doors opened, and she stepped into a hallway lined with portraits of former CEOs, men who had built their fortunes on the suffering of others, men who had lived and died without ever understanding the true cost of their success, men who stared down at her with painted eyes that seemed to judge her for daring to challenge their legacy. Marcus Blackstone's office was at the end of the hall, behind double doors made of wood that had probably cost more than most people's cars, behind a barrier that was designed to keep people like Sarah out, people who didn't belong in this world of marble and mahogany, people who were supposed to know their place and stay in it. But Sarah had learned long ago that barriers were meant to be broken, that rules were meant to be bent, that the only thing that mattered in this world was power, and power was something that could be taken if you were smart enough, patient enough, ruthless enough to seize it. She knocked on the door, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the hallway like gunshots, and waited for the voice that would invite her in, the voice that would seal Marcus Blackstone's fate, the voice that would begin the final chapter of a story that had started with fire and smoke and death. "Come in," Marcus called, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of being obeyed without question, from decades of having his every whim catered to, from a lifetime of believing that he was untouchable, that he was above the consequences of his actions. Sarah pushed open the doors and stepped into an office that was larger than the apartment she had shared with her family, an office with windows that offered a view of Manhattan that most people would never see, an office that was designed to intimidate and impress, to make visitors feel small and insignificant in the presence of true power. Marcus Blackstone stood behind his desk, a man who had grown soft and comfortable in his success, a man who had forgotten what it was like to struggle, who had forgotten that the people he had stepped on to reach the top were still out there, still fighting, still planning their revenge. He was not alone, Sarah noticed, because arrayed around the room were the members of his board of directors, 12 men who had gathered to witness what they thought would be the dismissal of a delusional woman, 12 men who had no idea that they were about to watch their world collapse around them. "Ms. Martinez," Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I understand you believe you own a significant portion of my company." Sarah smiled, an expression that was as cold as winter wind, as sharp as broken glass, as dangerous as a loaded gun, because she had been waiting for this moment for 15 years, because she had sacrificed everything to be standing in this room, because she was about to reveal a truth that would destroy everything Marcus Blackstone had built. "I don't believe anything, Mr. Blackstone," she said, her voice steady and calm. "I know exactly what I own, and I know exactly how I acquired it." She set her briefcase on his desk, the sound of leather against wood echoing through the room like a judge's gavel, and opened it to reveal documents that represented years of careful planning, years of patient accumulation, years of waiting for this perfect moment. "As of 9 a.m. this morning," she said, pulling out a stack of papers that were worth more than most countries' GDP, "I own 49% of Blackstone Industries, acquired through a series of shell companies and investment vehicles over the past 18 months. The silence in the room was absolute, the kind of silence that comes before explosions, before buildings collapse, before empires fall, and Sarah could see the exact moment when Marcus Blackstone realized that his life was about to change forever. "That's impossible," he whispered, but his voice carried no conviction, because he could see the truth in her eyes, because he could feel the noose tightening around his neck, because he was beginning to understand that he had been outmaneuvered by someone he had never seen coming. "Nothing is impossible when you have enough patience and enough money," Sarah said, spreading the documents across his desk like a dealer laying out cards, "and I have had 15 years to accumulate both." She watched his face change as he read the papers, watched the color drain from his cheeks as he realized the scope of what she had accomplished, watched his hands shake as he understood that his empire was no longer his own, that he was no longer the king of his castle, that he was now at the mercy of someone who had every reason to destroy him. "But why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this? Why would you spend so much time and money to acquire a company you've never worked for, a company you have no connection to?" Sarah leaned forward, her hands flat on his desk, her eyes boring into his like lasers, like knives, like the fires of hell itself, and spoke the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Because 15 years ago, your company destroyed my family's neighborhood to build a luxury development, and when the residents refused to move, you arranged for a fire that killed my parents and my 2 brothers, and you've been living off the profits of their blood ever since." The words hung in the air like smoke, like poison gas, like the ghost of everyone Marcus Blackstone had ever destroyed, and Sarah could see the recognition dawning in his eyes, could see him remembering the South Side Development Project, the insurance payouts, the families who had been displaced, the fire that had cleared the land for his luxury condos. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice shook with the weight of his lies, with the memory of decisions made in boardrooms like this one, decisions that had seemed so abstract at the time, so removed from the human cost, so easy to justify in terms of profit margins and return on investment. "You visited my landlord 3 days before the fire," Sarah said, her voice as cold as winter wind, as sharp as broken glass. "You wore the same cologne you're wearing now, you carried the same briefcase you have sitting beside your desk, you made him an offer he couldn't refuse." She reached into her briefcase again and pulled out a photograph, a picture of a young girl with bright eyes and a smile that suggested she believed the world was a good place, a picture of someone who had died in that fire along with her parents and brothers, someone who had been reborn as something harder, something more dangerous, something that had spent 15 years planning this moment. Her name was Sarah Martinez, she said, placing the photograph on his desk. She was 17 years old. She was going to be the first person in her family to go to college, she was going to be a teacher, she was going to make the world a better place. Marcus stared at the photograph, his face gray with understanding, with the weight of consequences he had never imagined would find him, with the realization that his past had finally caught up with him in the form of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from his destruction. "She died in that fire," Sarah continued, "along with her dreams, along with her innocence, along with her faith that good things happen to good people, and in her place stands someone who has learned that the only justice in this world is the justice you create for yourself." The board members had been listening in stunned silence, their faces reflecting the horror of what they were hearing, the understanding that they were witnessing the unraveling of a man they had trusted, a man they had followed, a man who had led them into a nightmare they couldn't escape. "Even if what you're saying is true," Marcus said, his voice desperate now, pleading, "you can't prove anything, you can't connect me to any fire, you can't destroy me with accusations." Sarah smiled again, but this time her expression was different, warmer somehow, like a cat that had finally cornered its prey, like a hunter who had waited patiently for the perfect shot, like someone who had saved the best for last. "I don't need to prove anything in court," she said, pulling out one final document from her briefcase, "because I'm not here to send you to prison, I'm here to do something much worse." She held up a single sheet of paper, a document that made Marcus Blackstone's blood turn to ice in his veins, a document that represented the culmination of 15 years of careful planning, the final piece of a puzzle that would complete her revenge. "This is a motion for a shareholder vote of no confidence," she said, "and with my 49% of the company, plus the 23% owned by the pension funds whose managers I've been speaking with, plus the 8% owned by the environmental groups who are very interested in your company's toxic waste disposal practices, I have exactly 80% of the votes needed to remove you as CEO. The room erupted in chaos, board members shouting at each other, phones ringing as news of the takeover spread through the financial district, security guards rushing in to maintain order, but through it all Sarah stood perfectly still, watching Marcus Blackstone's world collapse around him with the kind of satisfaction that comes from a job well done. "You can't do this," he screamed, his composure finally cracking, his mask of respectability falling away to reveal the monster underneath. "I built this company. I made it what it is. You're nothing, you're nobody, you're just some girl from the ghetto who got lucky." Sarah walked around the desk, her movements slow and deliberate, like a predator circling wounded prey, and stood directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had consumed her family, the same fire that had forged her into someone capable of this moment. "You're right," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I am just some girl from the ghetto, but I'm the girl from the ghetto who now owns your company, who controls your future, who decides whether you leave here with your dignity intact or in handcuffs." She gestured toward the window, toward the city spreading out below them, toward the world that had been his kingdom and was now hers to command. "Every building you see out there, every business, every life, they're all connected to decisions made in rooms like this one, by people like you, people who never think about the consequences of their actions, people who never consider the human cost of their success." She turned back to face him, and in her eyes he could see not just anger but something deeper, something that had been building for 15 years, something that would never be satisfied with just his destruction but would require the complete transformation of everything he had built. "I'm going to take your company apart piece by piece," she said. "I'm going to sell off the profitable divisions to companies that treat their workers fairly. I'm going to donate the toxic waste sites to environmental groups who will clean them up properly. I'm going to use your fortune to build schools and hospitals in neighborhoods like the one where I grew up." Marcus fell back into his chair, the weight of his defeat pressing down on him like a physical force, the understanding that he had lost everything washing over him like a tide of despair, the realization that he would be remembered not as a successful businessman but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. "But most importantly," Sarah said, leaning down so that her face was level with his, so that he could see every detail of the scars that marked her journey from victim to victor, "I'm going to make sure that every decision I make, every policy I implement, every dollar I spend, honors the memory of the people you killed, the families you destroyed, the dreams you crushed." She straightened up and looked around the room at the board members, at the men who had enabled Marcus Blackstone's crimes, who had profited from his ruthlessness, who were now faced with the choice of adapting to a new reality or being swept away by it. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, "you have a choice to make. You can work with me to transform this company into something that serves the community instead of exploiting it, or you can join Mr. Blackstone in looking for new employment." One by one, the board members began to nod their agreement, their faces showing the calculation of men who understood that the game had changed, that the rules were different now, that survival meant adapting to a new world order where conscience mattered more than profit margins. Sarah walked to the window and looked out at the city below, at the millions of people going about their daily lives, most of them unaware that a small piece of justice had been served in a boardroom high above their heads, most of them unaware that the world had become a slightly better place because someone had refused to accept that the powerful should be allowed to destroy the powerless without consequence. Behind her, she could hear Marcus Blackstone crying, the sound of a man who had finally been forced to confront the true cost of his actions, the sound of someone who had spent his entire life believing he was above the rules, discovering that no one is above the rules forever, that every action has a reaction, that every choice has a consequence. The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Sarah of the fire that had started her journey, the fire that had taken everything from her but had also given her the strength to take everything from the man who had caused it, the fire that had ended one story and begun another. She thought about her parents, about her brothers, about the life she might have lived if Marcus Blackstone had never decided that his profit was more important than their lives, and she felt a peace she hadn't experienced in 15 years. A sense that the universe had finally balanced itself, that justice had finally been served. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of rebuilding, of transforming Blackstone Industries into something that served the community instead of exploiting it, of using the fortune built on suffering to create opportunities for people who had never had them, of making sure that what happened to her family never happened to anyone else. But tonight, as the last light faded from the sky and the city below began to twinkle with the lights of millions of lives, Sarah Martinez stood in the office that had once belonged to her enemy and was now hers, surrounded by the wreckage of an empire built on greed and cruelty, and allowed herself to smile with the satisfaction of someone who had proven that even in a world where money talks and power corrupts, sometimes the girl from the ghetto gets the last word. Marcus Blackstone would leave the building that night in disgrace, his reputation destroyed, his fortune seized, his legacy transformed from one of success to one of cautionary tale, and he would spend the rest of his life knowing that he had been brought down not by the government, not by his competitors, not by market forces, but by a 17-year-old girl who had refused to let his crimes go unpunished. The newspapers would call it the takeover of the century, business schools would study it for decades, and historians would mark it as the moment when corporate America learned that there are some lines that should never be crossed, some people who should never be underestimated, some fires that burn so bright they can consume entire empires. But for Sarah Martinez, it was simply the end of a long journey home, the completion of a promise made to the ghosts of her family, the final chapter in a story that had begun with tragedy and ended with justice, the proof that sometimes the good guys win, sometimes the powerful fall, sometimes the system works exactly as it should. They had treated her like trash, but she had risen from the ashes to buy their company, to claim their power, to rewrite their story, and in doing so, she had proven that in America, the land of second chances and new beginnings, even a girl from the south side of Chicago can change the world if she's willing to pay the price, if she's willing to wait for the right moment, if she's willing to never give up on the dream of justice.